So, Mortonite's Blade has just released, and with him has probably come the most positive reception we've seen from a character since Tribbie. And honestly, it makes sense, considering he's one of the very few characters that feels complete at E00, and can revive some very popular older DPS while doing so. And although I still believe he's far from a must-pull, considering there are many accounts out there that make no immediate use of him, I understand why some people may think otherwise. As a result of all this discussion, there are a lot of people who currently own Mortonite's Blade, which means they also own one of the most important pieces of the new follow-up team. Because of this, things like an Ashvale rerun and the release of the main follow-up DPS are now on many people's radars, myself included. So then, I think it's important that we're all caught up to speed on what follow-up looks like nowadays. But it's important to understand that follow-up is far from a new archetype, so we should get a rundown of all the previous follow-up characters and get an update on how things have changed for them. Before we begin though, I want to be clear that I will only discuss characters that I'd consider to be part of the archetype. As such, characters like Gion, Yunli, Lingsha, or anyone else who doesn't provide or gain from running other follow-up characters will not be included. With that out of the way, it only makes sense that we start with the first dedicated follow-up character released, Herta. Now weirdly enough, Herta has actually managed to perform well for a decent portion of her lifetime, and a lot of it comes down to the inclusion of Pure Fiction in version 1.6. Now back then, the combination of Herta and Himeko was able to consistently clear well and get strong clears for nearly any account. However, ever since Pure Fiction changed in version 2.7, Herta's standalone performance has lowered dramatically, as her damage plummets once you've reached the third wave. Because of this, and the significant HP inflation that Pure Fiction continuously gets, Herta is rarely used just for her damage these days. Instead, her use is more to enable the kits of modern carries, notably the Herta, Ashvale, and Mortonite's Blade. When she's played strictly as a support for these characters, her exceedingly high attack frequency in Pure Fiction can result in really strong performances. As such, any team that relies on attack frequency will often perform well by slotting Herta into their Pure Fiction teams, which I'd say is quite a favorable position to be in for a version 1.0 4-star. In contrast, the next character has had a far more shaky lifetime in the meta, with that character being Topaz. Now unfortunately, I struggle to find many good things to say about Topaz, because in a strictly meta perspective, she was rarely best in slot for any team throughout her lifetime, especially at E00. This is the case because her baseline kit is lacking in a lot of areas, her damage is mediocre at best, and her attack frequency is quite low. As a result, she unfortunately holds zero place in the current meta, as follow-up's identity is far more solidified than it was back in her release. There are multiple reasons for this, but much of it stems from her noticeably low attack frequency in comparison to her competition. For a kit like Feixiao, Ashvale, and Blade, they rely heavily on attack frequency to function at their highest performance, so Topaz's lack of it hurts a lot. But you may have noticed that I didn't include Ratio in that list, and that's because he's also fallen off in the meta. Now at the time of his release, he was undoubtedly one of the strongest DPS in the game, arguably the best DPS for a short time, which was extremely valuable considering he was free. But today, he lacks the numbers and synergy with newer kits to provide anything of notable use. Much of the reason why stems from an inherent flaw in most DPS kits, which is how greedy they are. Now DPS like Ratio often ask a lot from their teammates, but provide little to nothing in return, making them easier to be pushed out of the meta. So then, once the raw multipliers are no longer competitive, they lack the fundamental mechanics to stay relevant. But shortly after, Aventurine was released, who was the premium sustain during version 2, and helped to alleviate the problems of follow-up at the time. Now back then, all you had was Ratio and Topaz, with Topaz only providing one debuff in her base kit, which was far from enough. But Aventurine had debuff application on his ultimate, his signature light cone, and his E2. All of this helped Ratio, and Acheron at the time, quite a lot. But nowadays, his overall utility has lost a lot of value, and he's gained far more competition. Unfortunately, his buffing and damage capabilities don't really compare to the newest limited sustains, and the inclusion of Blade has led to teams preferring a healer over a shielder. As such, he isn't a terrible alternative, he just isn't your first, second, or even third choice in the newest follow-up teams. Following Aventurine's release, we've got Robin, which was another instance of follow-up getting a dedicated support that ended up being strong enough to be placed in virtually any team. Now back then, Robin completed the core of Feixiao, Topaz, Robin, and Aventurine, which many view as the glory days for follow-up as an archetype. Even back then, things were far from perfect, like the need for Topaz or Aventurine signature to get enough debuffs for Feixiao, but the core was very strong and satisfying to play once it was complete. As time went on though, many teammates joined and left the follow-up archetype, but Robin was one of the few who remained for a very long time, and can still see play today. However, in the most recent rendition of the follow-up core, Robin is rarely considered to be a best-in-slot choice, and much of the reason why stems from a subtle but important shift in design philosophy, as attack frequency now matters most. Because of this, Robin trading attack frequency in exchange for high raw buffs ended up hurting her longevity. It's for this reason that Tribbie has predominantly usurped Robin's spot in follow-up teams, as she provides both a large quantity of buffs and high attack frequency. In doing so, she can not only enable the kits of the newest follow-up characters, but can also provide buffs to each team member, which is important considering follow-up is comprised of multiple damage dealers. On the topic of attack frequency, we can shift our focus to the 4 stars that centered around follow-up, starting with Hunt March 7th. Now, she may have released the patch before Feixiao, but it's clear to see that she was mostly built with Feixiao in mind, considering her and Moze were essentially tailor-made supports for her. Between the two, March had the upside of being extremely good in fights that required high toughness damage, which led to strong performances in a game mode like Apocalyptic Shadow. This combination of Feixiao and Hunt March 7th led to some of the best Apocalyptic Shadow clears of any team back in the day. But funnily enough, Hunt March is also one of the few who somewhat survived, but she's mostly abandoned her follow-up core and instead sees play in break teams as a main DPS. And while there are likely very few people who actually play her this way, the release of Dahlia has unironically led to her performing quite well in that role, and is a viable team for non-Firefly owners. Before we get into Moze though, let's first talk about Jade, who released alongside Hunt March 7th, and also had a stacking mechanic tied to her follow-ups. Now, while Hunt March excelled in single target fights, Jade took the opposite approach of being entirely focused on AoE scenarios. Naturally, this led to many people playing her in pure fiction, or specific Apocalyptic Shadow fights. And for a time, she performed quite well in these scenarios. But as time went on, she fell into the same position as Herta, where her damage couldn't keep up with HP inflation. But just like Herta, this meant that her value instead shifted into enabling the kits of others, which is notable for the previously mentioned characters. It's also important to note that Jade's E1 enabled synergy with some single target DPS, but her overall lack of buffing and subpar damage still led to her struggling to keep up. And then we have Moze, whose entire relevance is tied to the DPS he's designed for, Feixiao. Now Moze is an interesting case, especially when you look at his strength in the past, as he's actually been best in slot with Feixiao since her release. This may shock people, as the core of Feixiao, Topaz, Robin, and Aventurine was likely her most played team historically, but Moze was almost always better than a low investment Topaz. This is the case because Feixiao directly translates attack frequency to additional ultimates, and Moze has the highest attack frequency amongst all sub-DPS options for her at the time, if you played him on Wind Set. For those who are willing to do so, the optimizations available with this combo oftentimes led to the most Feixiao ults out of any composition, which resulted in the best clears. But when you look at him today, while his best teammate is Feixiao, Feixiao no longer has him as her best teammate. Because of this, while he's a viable alternative in sustainless compositions, there are enough alternatives in Feixiao comps to push him out of relevance. And finally, we've got the main push follow-up character herself, Feixiao. Now for reasons I described in my last video, Feixiao is a really weird character to discuss meta-wise, as her longevity and overall strength are directly tied to how good you are at playing her. But for most people, she was a very strong DPS that held up until about the middle of Amphoreus. The thing with Feixiao is that her baseline performance was strong, but she couldn't hold out for very long, especially considering how much version 3 changed the landscape of the game. But for the sweatiest of players out there, she could consistently clear some of the hardest content with the best scores, because of her extremely high skill ceiling. But nowadays, even for the players who can reach her skill ceiling, it's hard to justify playing her when much of the newer teams can reach those heights without nearly as much effort. The inclusion of Ashvale and Blade has done a lot for her, but the issue is that she doesn't do much for them. Because of this, running her instead of the other third slot contenders is rarely your best choice, albeit an entirely viable one in the right hands or with the right investment. So while almost all of these characters had their time to shine at some point in the meta, the truth is that the lack of support for follow-up during Amphoreus led to many people dropping the archetype. But you may have noticed I left out the newest follow-up characters, and that's because the impact they've made on not only follow-up, but the meta as a whole, has led to many people calling this duo the new wheelchair. This is the case because the combination of both Ashvale and Blade is such a synergistic core offensively and defensively that the core can elevate a lot of teams into reaching a strong performance. But to understand why that's the case, we need to view this combo through two different perspectives. First, there's the obvious, which is that they deal a lot of damage in all scenarios. This is because Ashvale's damage profile is extremely effective in single target fights, whereas Blade's damage profile excels in AoE fights. As such, they can cover each other's weaknesses, alongside providing enough attack frequency to enable each other. Then you've got their supportive capabilities, as the buffs that each character provides to the team are comparable to Harmony characters. For Ashvale, he provides 40 Death Shred, 40 crit damage, and an additional 80 crit damage to follow up attacks. Then for Blade, he provides 50 damage percent, 30 Death Shred, 50% vulnerability, and a conditional 75% ultimate damage buff. Furthermore, both of these characters have a mechanic that either refunds or makes it impossible to consume skill points. Mind you, this is all just at E0 as 0, and only scales higher with specific Eidolons, like Blaze E2, or buffing light cones, like Cypher's signature. With all this in mind, the sheer damage amp they provide is enough to warrant playing them in many places, but their extremely high damage on top of those buffs solidifies them as a very oppressive core. In truth, the synergy they have with each other, and their general ability to be slotted into multiple different teams, is very reminiscent of our last wheelchair with Hyacinth and Tribbie. Biggest reason why I can say this is because the similarities are so potent that oftentimes it's ideal to combine these wheelchairs together into the same team. Funnily enough, in an environment where sustain is necessary, this is actually one of their strongest teams, and is likely the strongest sustained team in the game currently. But the best part about this duo is just the sheer flexibility in your options for the last two slots, and the synergy they have with older and newer characters. For example, a DPS like Acheron slots amazingly well into this team, and more importantly, is strong enough to warrant being played over other supports at certain investment levels. This is because the buffs they provide are extremely coveted for an Acheron team, and the attack frequency Acheron provides is utilized extremely well from both Ashvale and Blade. It's not a perfect synergy, as an Acheron at E0 could sometimes lose too much damage to be an upgrade over other slots. There's also the fact that Acheron will likely hold the team back in a single target fight, but in the matchups where she excels, she's genuinely a strong choice here. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a DPS like Feixiao, who similarly has very high attack frequency, but struggles a lot in AoE fights. And while the damage distribution in this team is more spread apart in comparison to Acheron, she provides enough utility to warrant being played if the situation favors her mechanics. However, Feixiao will always have the caveat of being extremely reliant on player skill, so your performance may vary. Then on the topic of supports, there are so many viable options depending on the situation or investment level, but I'd say the notable ones are Tribbie, Robin, Hyacinth, and Dipped. Some of these choices are quite self-explanatory, as Tribbie has largely usurped Robin as the premium follow-up support character, and Blade would prefer a healer, which naturally means Hyacinth is the strongest option. But for the other two, they both have notable interactions that weren't being played in certain scenarios. Firstly, for Robin, while she's undoubtedly worse than Tribbie at equal investment, it's important to note that her inclusion in the shop should alleviate this point somewhat. This is important because her E1 and E2 are both quite impactful for this duo, and shorten the gap in performance between her and Tribbie. I'd like to be clear that I'm not recommending you to grab these Eidolons to replace Tribbie, as her attack frequency will keep her above Robin's performance in almost all scenarios. However, for those who still need Tribbie in other teams, it could be valuable to know that Robin isn't far behind, and could be situationally better with high investment. And for sustains, we have Dipped, someone who has high synergy and low synergy within the team. Now while Ashvale appreciates his attack buff and attack frequency, Blade is not receiving any buffs, and would prefer a healer over a shielder. It's for this reason that Hyacinth is often the better option, but Dipped is far from a bad alternative if you manage Blade's HP drain well enough, or clear fast enough. It's also important to note that Dipp's light cone does slightly help, considering he's providing healing, but it can only delay the problem, not solve it. So let's instead shift our focus onto what relics they use, and how things can change depending on the environment. Before that though, I want to give a small disclaimer to the people out there who have a deep-seated hatred towards Wind Set. It will be mentioned a lot here. The truth is that Wind Set is very effective for follow-up teams, specifically because attack frequency is so important to enable the kits of its many team members. It's this exact concept that has led to Robin being pushed out of the team in favor of Tribbie. So for some characters, Wind Set is a bit of a no-brainer. To list a few, I'd say the characters that have little reason to run anything else these days are Herta, Hunt March, Moze, and Feixiao. Now for the first three, there's not much to say beyond the fact that their entire value relies on attacking a lot, considering their damage is far too minuscule to build into. As such, they often run Wind Set and focus on speed subs while happily accepting any crit stats that come along the way. Then, outside of optimized zero cycle setups, they usually don't have any specific speed requirements, so you can adopt a bigger equal to better mentality when building them. Their planner sets can get a little complicated depending what setting they're in, but for Herta, who's predominantly used in pure fiction, her options are a lot wider depending on what you need her to do. If you just need her to battery another carry, then you'd go Von Whack. If you want her to buff, then you'd go for Lushaka or Converging Stars. And if you need more damage from her to deal with the first two waves of pure fiction, Sigonia could be your best choice. For Moze and March, they want to speed up the rotation as fast as possible, so a planner like Von Whack is very strong if the small damage increase from something like Ushaka isn't necessary, which it often isn't. But some people may be surprised to hear Feixiao was also mentioned, though I'd argue she synergizes the most with the Wind Set out of any DPS in the game. Now if we look at her current best teams, which is the combo of Feixiao, Ashvale, Mortonax Blade, and either Hyacin or Tribbie, you may notice that the damage distribution is far more evenly split than other Ashvale Blade comps. This is because while Feixiao gains a lot from their buffs, they also gain a lot from her exceedingly high attack frequency. As a result, it's optimal to play into the strength by wearing Wind Set on her and having her act as much as possible, which provides charge to Ashvale and Blade. An additional aspect that's quite important is that Ashvale and Blade provide 0 attack percent buffs, which will then make any source of attack percent very valuable. And Wind Set lets you put Feixiao on attack boots without losing too much attack frequency, giving you the best of both worlds. Not to mention that Feixiao is probably the only person who'd wear Wind Set that can actually utilize the two-piece effect. And then for her planners, we've gotten a few new options, but Duran is still usually her best. However, the difference between it and the other competitive options is so minuscule that you could just run whichever has the best substats. Beyond those four, we have some other characters that situationally really benefit from Wind Set, but it gets a little complicated. For example, you've got Jade, someone who can utilize Wind Set for much of the same reasons that Herta can, but is only built like that for specific reasons. Whether it be energy funneling, attack frequency, or just to act before pivotal moments in a fight, she can utilize the set well. However, in comparison to Herta, her damage isn't something you'd want to sacrifice on. So as such, maintaining her offensive build of Duke plus Converging Stars is often the better default option. Furthermore, Tribbie is put in a similar spot, where she gains a lot from either build. However, at the investment level where most people play Tribbie, which is E1 with DDD, I'd say sacrificing her damage in exchange for Wind Set is generally preferable. Much of the reason why stems from the lack of her E2 or Light Cone, as both investment levels are a noticeable improvement to her personal damage, enough to warrant building into it. Without those things, her main role is often to support the team, meaning that you'd usually gain more from trading her damage to instead be built with Wind Set and Von Whack. However, I'd like to emphasize that when she's paired with Ashvale and Blade, you really can't go wrong with either option. On one hand, Tribbie's damage is far higher considering the buffs that Ashvale and Blade provide. On the other hand, you're trading her damage to instead enable their kits more. Which one ends up being stronger than the other is very context dependent, so an all-encompassing build is near impossible to recommend. To further prove that point, we can shift our focus to Mortonax Blade, quite possibly the character that fluctuates the most with his builds. I say this because the sheer range of teams that he's played in, and the different contexts that arise because of that, often changes what his optimal set is. So then, in an effort to make things more manageable, I'll break things down like this. If he's being played with Ashvale, build him for damage. If he's being played strictly to enable a DPS, like Acheron, put him on Wind Set. If you want to use him as a pseudo-sustain, put him on the Guard Set. Now, even when saying that, there's a lot of nuance there, enough to where the situations can flip depending on investment or goals. For instance, if your Ashvale is much higher investment than your Blade, it's possible you prefer to put him on Wind Set instead. Or maybe you need to put Guard on him for a specific Zero Cycle run. And for the people that got lucky with his new set, maybe your substats are so good that it's best to always build him for damage. Context changes things a lot, but I think the general guideline I gave out fits most of those scenarios. Now, regarding the main stats, there's unfortunately a lot of nuance there too, but there are some things that remain largely consistent. Firstly, you basically always want him on speed boots, as it's generally preferable to be at least above 141 speed to act twice in his zone without help from DDD or Wind Set. It's important to note that you should be shooting for higher than this if possible. It's just that you'd prioritize speed over crit subs until this benchmark is reached. Then, for his orb, I'd say he generally prefers to be on HP, simply because he obtains enough damage percent from his own kit. Also, there's the additional factor that increasing his survivability is very useful, not to mention efficient for his damage, as managing his HP pool is a large portion of his gameplay loop. But his body and rope can change a lot depending on the environment. For the body, I'd say you put him on crit in an Ashvale team, because his damage should be maximized. However, in essentially any other team, especially in Zero Cycles, you prefer him on an HP body, mostly for the aforementioned reasons of having more survivability and HP to work with. Then for rope, it's much more of a toss-up depending on what you want. If he's paired with Ashvale, he generally gains more from running ER rope to funnel more charge into him through ults. However, for any other team, it could differ a lot depending on how much energy he's getting from enemies. HP rope gains a lot of value in sustainless teams or aggressive fights, just to stay alive. And for less aggressive fights, you may need ER rope just to maintain a high frequency of ults or to maximize Wind Set procs. But to make things simple, I'll say that for Ashvale teams, you generally go crit, speed, HP, ER. And for any other team, you'd go HP, speed, HP, and HP or ER. On that topic, Blade's planar sets tend to be either Bone Collector or Von Whack, depending on the team. For Ashvale comps, it's almost always Bone Collector, for obvious reasons. However, Von Whack is a very strong option for the many people who don't own a signature, given that your highest priority is getting out your zone as fast as possible. Now for the other follow-up characters, there's comparatively far less nuance in their build options, as many of them either run the generic Duke plus follow-up tailored planar sets, or their sets essentially haven't changed since release. So, to save you time, I won't go over the details for each of them, and will instead advise you to watch one of the many guides about those characters by other creators. But now that the builds are out of the way, you might be wondering what's the best way to invest into follow-up nowadays. For this question, I'll look at it from the perspective of a new player who's interested in what's the best way to start from scratch. So then, what's the first pull that an account like that should make? Well, I'd say the very first pull should be Blade. I say this not just because he's strong in the follow-up core, but he's such a strong generalist for a lot of teams, and can revive some older characters on your account single-handedly. I'd then stick with E0 as 0 for now, and look towards picking up Ashvale in the next rerun. Again, I say this not just because he's a core member to the newest follow-up teams, but because the duo of Blade and Ashvale is also a very strong supportive core for a lot of DPS. Then your next goal would be to pick up Blade's E2, as it's single-handedly the strongest early Eidolon to grab for any team that uses this duo. Now the thing I really like about recommending Blade's E2 is that he's one of the few characters who has a good E1 that you can grab on the way to his E2. As such, if you got unlucky and can only grab his E1 during the banner's uptime, you're far from unhappy with that outcome. As for many teams, that E1 translates to just basically 20% more team DPS. When you compare that to someone who'd be stuck with fine on E1 in their effort to obtain his E2, you're far less depressed. But after that, your next, and arguably final goal, is to grab Ashvale's E1. Now it's important to note that the increase from Ashvale's E1 isn't too far off from his signature, but both Ashvale and Blade have multiple strong alternative light cones that are older. When you compare that to a comp like Mana Rem, the lack of light cone dependence for this duo should be something that you abuse, by instead reallocating that cost into their Eidolons. Now, beyond those 4 investment points, everything after this varies a lot depending on what team you're playing and what investment you already have. Furthermore, this team is currently lacking its dedicated DPS, and it's quite common for newer DPS to have an extremely strong E1 or E2 to shoot for. As such, I say this is the most investment I'd recommend people to put into this duo, for now, just to stay ahead of whatever future characters get released for this archetype. But it's important to realize that even within those 4 investment stopping points, there's a lot of nuance when assessing if those decisions fit best with your account. For instance, you could very easily prefer Astral's Sig over his E1 if you don't own any of the older limited hunt Lycones, or are unwilling to buy a battle pass to grab Topaz's Lycone from the shop. Then for Blade, if one of your other teams is Dot, that would mean your tutorial needs to be on Kafka instead. As such, grabbing his Lycone or Cypher's Lycone would be very valuable for you. Either way, so long as you understand that recommendations like this are not set in stone and will not reflect every person's account, you should be able to create the best investment path for yourself. If this is something you struggle with, I'd highly recommend you utilize one of the many resources out there and ask informed people what the optimal investments would be for your account. This is a far more effective tool than relying on pull priority lists to determine the strongest investment routes, as the context of your account will often change the answer. But enough about how these characters should be built. Let's put some attention on the best ways to play them. Now, if you're deeply interested in the best ways to play a character, I'm a firm believer that you should be watching showcases of them. Whether you check out theherta.com and find some clears using characters you own, or watch some of the many HSR creators that make showcase videos, watching someone use those characters directly in the newest endgame rotation will be the best way to learn. But there are a lot of general tips and tricks that I can share, and some aspects of their kits you may not know about. For instance, a simple yet very important thing to learn about Mortonak's Blade is when you should be holding his ultimate. Now for the teams that run him on Wind Set, your instinct may be to use his ultimate off cooldown, but the existence of his countdown changes things a lot. This is because his kit essentially stops working if his zone is ever dropped, so saving his ultimate when his countdown is about to proc is pivotal to maintain 100% uptime on his zone. On the topic of Blade, another aspect of his kit that I've heard very few people talk about is the fact that his basic attack applies Taunt onto the enemy for 1 turn. It's important to note that Taunt is very different from having Aggro, and is far more effective. This is because Aggro, otherwise known as Taunt value, is the likelihood you have of being hit. However, when an enemy is applied the Taunt status effect, this overrides any Taunt values, and guarantees that the enemy will hit you. As such, any attack that's coded to hit a specific enemy will be redirected to the character that applied the taunt, which can lead to scenarios that normally should never occur. If my understanding is correct, it doesn't seem as though Blade can miss this effect, as I've yet to see him fail to apply this debuff through my testing, and nothing in the wording implies otherwise. As such, you can abuse this to guarantee that Blade is targeted by specific moves, even things like the Lycus attack that gives a free ultimate to the character he targets. Truthfully, the possibilities that you have for this ability are endless, and can be used to mitigate hit RNG for zero cycles or casual runs alike. Then for our last optimization, I'd like to bring back an ult tech that was used in a lot of zero cycles back in the day, getting 3 Robin ults in the first cycle. Now I bring this up because not only is Robin a very strong option in sustainless follow-up teams again, but now more people have access to Robin C2, which makes her energy problems a lot easier to manage. But for people who don't know, when you play Robin in MOC, so long as you can ult before 112 AV is passed in the first cycle, Robin's concerto state will still fall within 150 AV. As such, if you can ration out your damage correctly, you can wait until Robin's ult is finished and kill them immediately afterwards. Then when you go into the next wave, if you spam your Robin ult fast enough, you can proc her ultimate at 0 AV, meaning you'll be able to act without having consumed any action value. This trick is so effective that if you can pull it off, you can often go from being just shy of reaching the zero cycle to instead overkilling the boss by a sizable amount. This is because you're not just getting a free rotation, you're also applying the important debuffs, getting closer to crucial ults, or getting closer to breaking the enemy. And out of any team that slots in Robin, Follow-Up is the comp that can do this trick easiest because of its extremely high attack frequency and the power you have to manage your resources. Now while this tech may only be notable for zero cycles, I hope that little things like this are starting to show just how impactful optimization is for follow-up. Perhaps it can even inspire you to seek out some showcases and learn other things that you can implement in your gameplay. So we can finally address the question that everyone is likely thinking. Is follow-up strong? And while the newest rendition of the team isn't complete, I can probably say that follow-up is firmly back in the meta. Right now, the duo of Ash Veil and Blade is so oppressive and universally applicable that I honestly find it hard to imagine an account that won't make use of the pair. I can say that because they're not only strong enough with Ultra DPS to revive them, but they're also the core for the newest rendition of the follow-up team. As such, they have great value for older accounts and newer accounts alike. But everything isn't perfect, since follow-up as an archetype looks entirely different from what it used to be. Because of this, while the archetype has revived, unfortunately, many of its characters haven't. So for a lot of us who invested in the older characters, we're just forced to wait for a Nova Flare if we want them to become best in slot. Follow-up might be back in the meta, but starting from scratch to build this newest rendition might not align with your pull plans. So while their strength is undeniable, what really matters is, will you pull them? I know a video of this nature has been requested many times, so I hope that I managed to satisfy those requests. And if this kind of thing's received well, I'm happy to make more. But just keep in mind that videos like this take a lot more time than usual. Speaking of that, it's very likely that I missed something or didn't delve into enough detail for certain aspects. So if you catch something, feel free to let me know. I'll leave a pinned comment at the top with any corrections I feel should be made. And I highly suggest you at least check that out before you leave. Anyways though, bye-bye!